I learned a long time ago that the quietest moment at a dinner table is usually the moment right before the truth walks in. That Easter evening started like every other family holiday we've had for the past 10 years. Warm lights over the dining room, a honey-glazed ham in the center of the table, and my daughter-in-law Maddie arranging pastel napkins like we were in a magazine ad for spring. My name is Robert Caldwell, though most people just call me Rob, and if you'd seen me sitting there in my old navy sweater pouring iced tea into a glass pitcher, you probably would have assumed I was just another retired guy enjoying a family meal. That assumption, as it turns out, was exactly what someone at that table was counting on. My son Jason was carving the ham while Emily, my wife of 32 years, passed around a bowl of roasted carrots. Conversation drifted the way it always does at holiday dinners: weather, work schedules, the usual small talk people use to avoid anything real. Maddie's friend Bree had arrived about 20 minutes earlier carrying a lemon pie and a smile that felt just a little too curious for someone who wasn't actually family. I noticed things like that. You learn to notice details when you've spent most of your life in business negotiations where the smallest expression can mean the difference between a deal and a disaster. Bree kept glancing around the room, not at the decorations or the food but at the people, like she was quietly measuring reactions before saying something important. Then I noticed the second detail that mattered. On the kitchen counter behind her, angled just enough toward the table, was a phone propped against a coffee mug. The camera lens was pointed directly at where I was sitting. Nobody mentioned it. Nobody needed to. I simply leaned back in my chair and took a slow sip of iced tea while the soft clink of forks and plates filled the room. Easter dinner in suburban Ohio rarely feels dramatic, but that night the air carried a strange kind of tension, the kind you can feel even when nobody has spoken yet. Bree cleared her throat and set her fork down like she had just remembered something fascinating. She leaned forward slightly, elbows near the table, and looked straight at me with a polite smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Mr. Caldwell," she said casually, like she was asking about the weather, "is it true you just got a $2.5 million check?" The words landed in the room like someone had quietly shut off the music. Jason stopped carving mid-slice. Maddie froze with the serving spoon in her hand. Even Emily paused before setting down the bowl she was holding. Nobody spoke for a second. Not because the question was shocking, but because everyone suddenly realized the same thing I had noticed 30 seconds earlier. This moment had been planned. And the person they expected to panic about it was me. No one rushed to fill the silence after Bree asked her question. That is the interesting thing about uncomfortable truths: people do not argue with them right away, they first try to understand who in the room already knows the answer. Jason slowly set the carving knife down beside the ham and looked at me the way a son looks at his father when he hopes the next sentence will make a situation disappear. Maddie kept her polite smile, but I noticed the way her fingers tightened around the silver serving spoon. Emily, my wife, simply placed the bowl of carrots on the table and folded her hands in front of her like she had already seen this exact moment coming. I did not rush either. I took another sip of iced tea and let the glass rest on the table with a soft click. 30 years in business teaches you something important about conversations that begin with numbers. People rarely ask about money because they are curious. They ask because they are testing a door to see if it opens. I looked around the table slowly, not because I needed time to think, but because I wanted to see who was watching Bree and who was watching me. That difference tells you everything about a room. The phone on the counter was still angled perfectly toward the table. Its screen glowed faintly, confirming what I had already guessed. It was recording. Maddie finally cleared her throat and gave a small laugh that sounded rehearsed. She said that Bree probably read something online and that people exaggerate things on the internet all the time. Bree shook her head quickly and smiled again, that same friendly smile that felt just a little too sharp. She said she only asked because she thought it was impressive and that not many people receive a check for $2.5 million out of nowhere. Out of nowhere. That phrase hung in the air like the smell of burned sugar. I noticed Jason glance toward the counter, and then quickly back at me. He saw the phone too. But he did not say anything. Instead he said that maybe we should just focus on dinner and enjoy the holiday. That was when I understood something clearly. This was not just curiosity. Someone at this table expected me to defend myself. They expected me to explain where the money came from, maybe stumble through the details, maybe say something careless that could later be replayed and discussed. People who set traps like that usually forget one important rule. If you are going to surprise someone, you should be very sure that they have not already noticed the trap. I rested my hands on the edge of the table and looked directly at Bree. Her eyes brightened slightly, like a person waiting for a show to start. Instead of answering her question immediately, I said something simple. I said that $2.5 million is a very specific number to bring up at a family dinner. The room stayed quiet. Emily gave the smallest nod beside me. Jason looked confused. Maddie shifted in her chair. And Bree leaned forward just a little more, clearly hoping the next sentence would be exactly what she came here to capture. The room stayed quiet long enough for the sound of the refrigerator humming in the kitchen to become noticeable. Bree was still leaning forward, waiting, and I could almost see the moment playing out in her mind. She expected me to explain myself. She expected hesitation, maybe embarrassment, maybe even a defensive story about where the money came from. Instead, I simply folded my napkin beside my plate and glanced once more toward the phone resting against the coffee mug on the counter. The screen was still glowing faintly. Whoever set that device there had not even tried to hide it well. That told me something important. They believed the situation was already under control. I looked back at Bree and spoke calmly. I said that money has a strange way of making people curious about details that are none of their concern. Jason shifted in his chair. Maddie quickly reached for the water pitcher and began filling glasses that were already half full, a small nervous motion that people make when they want to redirect attention without saying anything. Bree laughed softly and said she did not mean any harm. She said everyone had been talking about it, and that she only asked because she admired success stories. The words sounded polite, but the tone carried a different message. She wanted confirmation. More importantly, she wanted me to say it out loud while that camera quietly recorded every word. I rested my hands on the table and looked directly at my son. Jason met my eyes for a moment before looking down at his plate. I could see the conflict in his expression. He knew something about this situation felt wrong, but he was not yet certain how deep it went. Emily reached over and adjusted the position of a candle in the center of the table, her movements calm and deliberate. My wife has always understood timing better than most people. When she finished, she looked at me and said one simple sentence. She said that sometimes the truth makes people uncomfortable because it shows them things they were not prepared to see. That sentence landed gently, but it shifted the room. Bree blinked, clearly unsure whether the comment was directed at her or at someone else entirely. Maddie finally set the pitcher down and forced another smile. She said it was only a conversation and that nobody meant anything serious by it. That was when I leaned slightly back in my chair and spoke again. I said that the interesting part of a question like Bree's is not the number itself. $2.5 million sounds dramatic at a dinner table, but numbers are rarely the real story. The real story is why someone wants the number repeated in the first place. Bree opened her mouth to respond, but I raised one hand gently and continued. I said that when people set a stage, they usually expect the person in the spotlight to follow a script. The mistake they make is assuming the person sitting there does not realize the stage was built in the first place. That was the moment the smiles around the table began to fade. Maddie looked toward the counter where the phone was recording. Jason followed her gaze. Bree slowly leaned back in her chair. And for the first time since the question had been asked, the person who looked uncertain was not me. The silence that followed did not feel like the silence from before. Earlier it had been curiosity, the kind that floats around a dinner table when someone asks a bold question. Now it felt different, heavier, like the room had suddenly realized the conversation was not unfolding the way it was supposed to. Bree shifted in her chair and glanced toward the kitchen counter again. That tiny movement told me everything I needed to know. She was not just waiting for my answer anymore. She was wondering whether the recording had already captured something useful. Jason cleared his throat and reached for his glass of water. He took a slow sip, then set the glass back down carefully, as if making any sudden movement might break whatever balance still existed at the table. Maddie forced a soft laugh and said that maybe everyone was overthinking things. She said Bree had simply been curious, and that people ask about money all the time. Her voice sounded calm, but I noticed she had not taken a single bite of food since the conversation began. Emily finally leaned back in her chair and folded her hands loosely in her lap. She did not look at Bree or Maddie. She looked at me, the same way she has looked at me during every major decision in our lives. Not questioning, not worried, just patient. I appreciated that more than she probably realized. I turned my attention back to Bree and spoke slowly so that every word carried across the table clearly. I said that curiosity is an interesting thing, because it usually arrives with a purpose. People rarely bring up specific numbers in casual conversation unless they are hoping that number leads somewhere. Bree blinked again, clearly unsure how to respond. She said she only meant that it must feel amazing to suddenly receive that kind of money. I nodded slightly and said that receiving money unexpectedly can indeed surprise people. But I added that what surprises me more is when someone asks about it in front of a camera without mentioning the camera first. That sentence landed exactly where I intended it. 2. Jason immediately turned his head toward the counter. Maddie followed his gaze. Bree froze for a moment before forcing a smile and saying that she had forgotten her phone was recording because she had been taking pictures earlier. The explanation arrived a little too quickly. I simply nodded again and said that recording family dinners can be a charming habit if everyone at the table knows about it. The room grew quieter. Even the faint hum of the refrigerator seemed to pause between cycles. Maddie reached for her napkin and folded it once, then twice, then set it down again without speaking. Jason looked back at me with a mixture of confusion and realization, the kind of expression people wear when they begin to see a situation from a completely new angle. Bree was still smiling, but the confidence behind that smile had started to fade. That was when I placed my hands flat on the table and said something that changed the direction of the evening entirely. I said that if someone is going to record a conversation about $2.5 million, then it would probably help if they understood where that number actually came from. Jason looked at me as if he was hearing a language he had never studied before. Maddie did not move at all. Bree was the only one who reacted immediately. She reached toward the counter like someone casually remembering an errand, picked up the phone, and said with a small laugh that she had forgotten it was even there. She turned the screen toward herself and tapped it quickly, the glow disappearing a second later. The phone was no longer recording. That tiny action told its own story. If the recording had truly been innocent, she would have left it where it was. I leaned back slightly in my chair and let the moment breathe. Across the table, Emily remained calm, watching the room the same way a seasoned chess player studies a board before the next move. Jason finally spoke. He said that nobody was trying to make a problem and that maybe the whole thing had just gotten awkward. His voice carried that careful tone people use when they want tension to dissolve without confronting its source. I nodded once, acknowledging the attempt. Then I looked back at Bree and said something very simple. I said that curiosity deserves a proper answer. Maddie's eyes lifted quickly toward me. She had expected me to avoid the subject or change the topic entirely. Instead, I reached slowly into the inside pocket of my jacket. The room followed the movement the way people watch a magician reach for a deck of cards. I pulled out 2 plain white envelopes and placed them carefully on the table between the plates and the candle. They were identical except for the words written across the front in black ink. On one envelope the word check was printed in clean capital letters. On the other envelope the word contract was written just as clearly. No one spoke. Bree looked at the envelopes the way a person looks at a prize on a game show table. Jason frowned slightly, trying to understand why I had brought them to dinner. Maddie stared at the words without blinking. Emily simply leaned back and waited. I rested my fingertips lightly on the table and said that since the conversation had already reached $2.5 million, it might be useful to show exactly what people were talking about. Bree's curiosity returned instantly. She leaned forward again, her earlier confidence slowly creeping back into her expression. She asked if that meant the check was actually real. I smiled slightly and said that the envelope labeled check did indeed contain a copy of the check everyone seemed so interested in. Her hand moved toward it almost without thinking. Jason opened his mouth as if he might stop her, but the moment had already passed. Bree lifted the envelope and opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper, a photocopy of a check with the number $2,500,000 printed clearly across the line. For a second she looked satisfied, like someone who had finally confirmed a rumor. Then she glanced back at me, expecting more explanation. Instead, I gently slid the second envelope a few inches closer to the center of the table. The one labeled contract. I said quietly that the number on that check was only half of the story, because money rarely arrives without a reason. The real explanation, I added, was inside the other envelope. For a few seconds no one reached for the second envelope. Bree was still holding the photocopy of the check, staring at the number again as if the ink might change if she looked long enough. $2,500,000 tends to do that to people. It pulls their attention so completely that they forget to ask the question that actually matters. Jason leaned forward and rubbed the back of his neck, the way he used to when he was younger, and trying to solve a problem that suddenly felt bigger than expected. Maddie kept her eyes on the envelope labeled contract, but she did not touch it. I noticed that. People who are confident usually grab answers quickly. People who suspect those answers might not help them tend to hesitate. Emily finally lifted her glass of iced tea and took a calm sip, the faint clink of ice against the glass sounding almost too loud in the quiet room. I rested my hand lightly beside the second envelope, and spoke in the same steady tone I had used all evening. I said that numbers alone rarely explain anything. $2.5 million can look like luck to someone who does not understand the story behind it. Bree slowly placed the photocopy of the check back inside its envelope and set it down on the table. Her earlier curiosity had shifted into something more cautious now. She looked at the second envelope again and asked if the contract explained why the check existed. I nodded once. I said that money usually arrives at the end of a process, not at the beginning. Contracts are the part most people ignore because they prefer simple stories about sudden wealth. Jason frowned slightly and asked what kind of contract we were talking about. His voice carried a mixture of concern and confusion that told me he was beginning to realize the evening had moved far beyond an awkward dinner question. Maddie finally reached toward the envelope but stopped halfway, as if touching it might somehow make the situation worse. She glanced briefly toward Bree, then back toward me. I could almost hear the thoughts moving through the room. People trying to decide whether the answer they were about to hear would make things better or much more complicated. I slid the envelope another inch forward across the table until it rested directly in the center between the plates. The candlelight reflected softly off the white paper. I said that inside the envelope was a copy of an agreement signed 3 weeks earlier. An agreement involving a business purchase. Bree's eyebrows lifted slightly. Jason looked even more confused. Maddie's face became very still. That reaction told me she understood something the others did not yet see. I continued calmly and explained that the check everyone seemed so interested in was not a prize or a surprise payment. It was a transaction. The final payment for the acquisition of a company. The room seemed to shrink slightly around the table. Jason asked which company? I let the silence sit for a moment before answering, because sometimes the timing of information matters as much as the information itself. Then I looked directly at Maddie and said that the contract in the envelope described the purchase of the company where her parents have worked for the past 20 years. For a moment nobody at the table moved. The words seemed to settle slowly, the way dust settles in a quiet room after someone opens a door. Jason blinked first. He looked from me to Maddie and then back again, trying to connect pieces that had never been in the same puzzle before. Bree's confident expression disappeared completely. She leaned back in her chair, the photocopy envelope still resting in front of her like a prop that had suddenly lost its purpose. Maddie did not speak at all. Her eyes stayed fixed on the envelope labeled contract sitting in the center of the table. Emily gently folded her hands again and watched the reactions the same way she always did when something important unfolded. She had lived beside me long enough to recognize the exact moment when a room realizes the conversation is no longer casual. Jason finally spoke, his voice quieter than before. He asked if I meant the manufacturing company where Maddie's father had worked since before we even met her. I nodded once. I said yes, the same company? The same building on the east side of town with the faded blue sign and the parking lot that always filled before sunrise. Jason's eyebrows drew together as the realization began to settle in. He said he thought that company had been struggling financially for years. I said that was correct. Businesses do that sometimes. They grow, they stall, they recover, and sometimes they change hands entirely. Bree looked at Maddie again, clearly trying to understand something she had not expected. Maddie finally reached forward and picked up the envelope marked contract. Her fingers moved more slowly than before, careful now, like someone opening a letter that might change the direction of their day. She slid the document out and scanned the first page. I watched her eyes move across the printed lines. People reveal a lot through the speed at which they read. When someone believes a document will confirm what they already think, they read quickly. When they suspect the document might contradict their assumptions, they slow down. Maddie slowed down. Jason leaned closer, trying to see the page from across the table. Bree shifted in her seat, suddenly far less interested in asking questions. The candle between the plates flickered slightly, casting a soft reflection across the polished surface of the table. Finally Maddie lifted her eyes from the paper and looked directly at me. Her voice was careful when she spoke. She asked when this agreement had been signed. I told her the date printed near the bottom of the page, 3 weeks earlier on a Tuesday afternoon. Jason shook his head slowly, as if he was replaying the past few weeks in his mind and noticing things he had not paid attention to before. Bree glanced toward the kitchen counter where the phone now rested quietly, no longer recording anything. The room felt different now. The earlier curiosity had faded, replaced by something more thoughtful and much less comfortable. I rested my hands calmly on the table and said that the check everyone had been so interested in was simply the final payment from that purchase. Not luck, not a surprise, just the closing step of a transaction. Then I added one final detail, the part that truly changed the expression on Maddie's face. I said that according to the contract she was holding, the new owner of that company was me. The words seemed to linger above the table long after I finished speaking. For a moment nobody reacted. Maddie still held the contract in her hands, but she was no longer reading it. She was staring at the page the way someone stares at a map that suddenly shows a completely different destination than the one they expected. Jason leaned forward slowly, his elbows resting near his plate, his eyes moving between me and the document like he was trying to confirm he had heard everything correctly. Bree looked like someone who had accidentally stepped into a conversation she no longer understood. Her earlier curiosity had turned into something quieter, something closer to caution. Emily remained exactly as she had been all evening, calm and composed, her posture relaxed but attentive. She had seen these moments before. Tension. Now it was reflection. Bree glanced toward the phone resting on the kitchen counter again, then quickly looked away. Whatever she had expected to capture earlier had clearly turned into something else entirely. Maddie slowly placed the contract back into the envelope and set it down in front of her. When she finally looked up at me again, the curiosity in her expression had been replaced by something more complicated. She asked why I had not mentioned any of this before tonight. I answered honestly. I said that business transactions usually stay private until they are complete. And besides, I added gently, nobody at the table had asked the right question until a few minutes ago. The room stayed quiet after my answer, but this time the silence did not feel sharp. It felt thoughtful, like everyone at the table was slowly rearranging the story in their heads. Jason leaned back in his chair and exhaled slowly, the way people do when they finally realize the conversation they thought they understood had been missing an entire chapter. Maddie looked down at the envelope again before sliding it gently across the table toward me. She did not push it hard. It moved slowly over the polished wood until it stopped near my hands. That small gesture carried more meaning than any argument could have. Bree sat very still now, her earlier curiosity replaced by something quieter, something closer to caution. She folded her hands together on the table and avoided looking at the phone on the counter. The candle in the center flickered again, reflecting softly in the glass of iced tea beside Emily's plate. Emily had not rushed a single word all evening. She simply watched the room, the same way she always had whenever people were learning something new about each other. Jason finally asked the question that had been forming in his mind since the moment I mentioned the acquisition. He asked whether Maddie's parents knew about the change in ownership yet. I told him that the official announcement would happen the following Monday morning at a staff meeting. The legal paperwork had been finalized only a few days earlier. Maddie lifted her eyes again and studied my face as if trying to measure something deeper than the words I had spoken. She asked quietly whether the purchase meant changes for the employees. That question carried a different tone from the earlier conversation. It was no longer about money. It was about people. I nodded slowly and said that every company eventually faces changes, but the goal of an acquisition is not always to replace what already works. Sometimes the purpose is to stabilize something that has been drifting for too long. Jason listened carefully, the tension in his shoulders easing just a little. He had always believed that businesses were distant things, complicated structures that lived somewhere outside the everyday lives of families. Now he was beginning to see how those worlds overlap more often than people realize. Bree shifted again in her seat and cleared her throat quietly. She said she had not intended to make the evening uncomfortable. I told her that conversations only become uncomfortable when people expect one outcome and receive another. Curiosity itself is not a problem. What matters is what people choose to do with the answers they receive. Maddie looked toward the kitchen counter again, toward the phone that had recorded the beginning of the evening. For a moment she seemed almost amused by it, as if realizing how different the conversation had become from whatever she had expected earlier. She folded her napkin carefully beside her plate, and looked back at me. Then she said something that changed the atmosphere in the room one more time. She said that if I was now the owner of the company where her father worked, then tonight's conversation might have been the most unusual introduction between an employer and an employee's family she had ever seen. Maddie's comment settled over the table like a quiet acknowledgement that the evening had taken a turn none of us expected. Jason let out a small breath and leaned back in his chair again, his expression somewhere between relief and disbelief. Bree gave a short laugh that sounded more nervous than amused. She said she had definitely not planned to attend a dinner where a business acquisition became the main topic. I told her that sometimes the most ordinary settings are where the most revealing conversations happen. Families tend to discover things about each other over meals more often than anywhere else. Emily finally reached for the serving spoon and gently slid the bowl of roasted carrots closer to Jason, as if reminding everyone that dinner had technically been the reason we were sitting there in the first place. This simple gesture broke a little of the tension that had filled the room. Jason began carving another slice of ham, though he was clearly still thinking about everything that had been said. Maddie rested her hands together on the table and studied the candle flame for a moment before speaking again. She said that her father had always described the company as a place that had seen better years but still mattered to the people who worked there. Her voice carried a careful sincerity that had not been present earlier in the evening. I nodded and told her that was exactly the reason the opportunity interested me. Businesses that still matter to their employees often deserve a second chapter instead of a quiet ending. Bree listened silently now, her earlier curiosity replaced by a kind of thoughtful restraint. Jason finally looked at me and asked what my plans were for the company moving forward. I explained that the first step after any acquisition is understanding the people who built the place long before the paperwork changed hands. A company is not only machinery and balance sheets. It is routines, relationships, and decades of experience that cannot be replaced overnight. Emily gave a small approving nod beside me. She had heard me say something similar many times over the years. Maddie seemed to relax slightly as she listened. She asked whether the employees would hear about the change directly from me. I said they would. On Monday morning I would be standing in the conference room with the management team and explaining the transition myself. Transparency tends to earn more trust than rumors whispered in hallways. Jason set the knife down and looked across the table at Maddie. For the first time since the conversation had shifted, his expression carried something steadier than confusion. He said that if her parents heard the news in that meeting they would probably be surprised but hopeful. Bree finally spoke again, her tone softer now. She said she guessed the check had turned out to be a very different kind of story than the one she imagined earlier. I told her that numbers often do that. They look dramatic when people hear them without context, but once the full story appears they usually represent something much more ordinary. Maddie glanced toward the kitchen counter where the phone rested quietly. She gave a small shake of her head, almost amused by how different the evening had become from the moment that question first landed on the table. Then she looked back at me and said that if Monday morning went well, her father might finally feel like the company he had spent 20 years helping build still had a future. The conversation had settled into something calmer now, the earlier tension replaced by a quiet sense of perspective that often arrives after people realize they misunderstood the situation from the beginning. Jason continued slicing the ham, this time actually placing pieces onto the plates around the table instead of pausing halfway through the task like he had earlier. The normal rhythm of dinner slowly returned, though the atmosphere was still thoughtful. Maddie took a small bite of food for the first time since Bree had asked her question, chewing slowly while her mind clearly worked through everything she had just learned. Bree sat with her hands wrapped around her glass of water, occasionally glancing toward the envelopes resting near the center of the table. The curiosity that had started the evening had transformed into something much more reflective. Emily finally spoke again, her voice gentle but steady. She said that one of the strange things about money is how quickly it can become the center of attention even when it is only a small part of a much larger story. I nodded slightly because that observation was exactly right. Numbers tend to attract attention, but they rarely explain the decisions that produce them. Jason looked at the envelopes again and asked how long the negotiation for the purchase had taken. I told him that discussions with the previous owners had started nearly 8 months earlier. Businesses rarely change hands overnight. There are inspections, financial reviews, legal agreements, and dozens of conversations that happen quietly long before anyone outside the process notices. Maddie listened closely to that part. She said that her father had mentioned a few months ago that the company might be looking for outside investors, but he never believed it would actually lead to a full transfer of ownership. I explained that the original plan had indeed been an investment partnership, but as the discussions continued it became clear that a full acquisition would provide more stability for the future of the company. Bree gave a small nod as if that explanation made sense now that she understood the context. The candle between us flickered again and cast warm light across the table. For the first time that evening the room felt almost peaceful. Jason finally leaned forward and rested his arms on the table, looking at me with a thoughtful expression. He said that if the company had been struggling, the purchase might actually be the best news the employees could receive. I told him that was certainly my hope. Companies survive through the people who show up every morning and believe their work still matters. Maddie listened quietly before speaking again. She said that her father had always worried about the future of the place, especially during the last few years when business slowed down. Hearing that made the entire evening feel even more meaningful in an unexpected way. Bree glanced again at the phone on the counter and gave a soft laugh at herself. She admitted that she had arrived thinking she was about to hear a dramatic story about sudden wealth. Instead, she had accidentally discovered something far more complicated and far more interesting. I told her that most real stories work that way. The dramatic part usually turns out to be the smallest detail once the full picture appears. Maddie looked around the table at all of us, and then said quietly that sometimes families learn the most about each other in the moments when assumptions fall apart. The dinner had finally returned to something that resembled a normal Easter evening, but the atmosphere still carried the quiet awareness that something important had unfolded at that table. Plates were no longer untouched, and the simple sounds of forks against porcelain slowly replaced the heavy silence that had filled the room earlier. Jason leaned back again after finishing another slice of ham, his expression thoughtful but calmer than before. Maddie sat with her hands loosely folded near her plate, occasionally glancing at the envelopes that still rested near the candle. They no longer looked like mysterious objects. They looked like paperwork, which is what they had been from the beginning. Emily reached for the iced tea pitcher and refilled a few glasses, moving with the same calm rhythm she always brought to family gatherings. She understood something that many people do not notice right away. Moments of tension can pass quickly when people stop assuming the worst about each other. Bree cleared her throat quietly and looked toward me with a small, slightly embarrassed smile. She said she hoped her question earlier had not caused more trouble than she intended. I shook my head gently and told her that sometimes uncomfortable questions simply arrive earlier than the answers people are ready to hear. Curiosity itself is rarely the problem. The real difficulty appears when curiosity is mixed with assumptions. Jason nodded slowly at that thought. He said that if someone had told him at the beginning of dinner that the conversation would turn into a discussion about a business acquisition, he probably would not have believed it. Maddie gave a soft laugh at that and admitted that she would have said the same thing. She looked toward the contract envelope again and said that it was strange to realize how quickly a single misunderstanding could change the direction of an entire evening. I told her that misunderstandings often begin with incomplete information. When people see only the number on a check, they rarely imagine the months or years of work that created it. Businesses grow through patience and careful planning, not through sudden surprises. Bree glanced again toward the phone on the kitchen counter and shook her head with a quiet smile. She said that when she first mentioned the number, she thought the story would be simple. Instead, it had turned into something far more interesting than she expected. I told her that real life rarely follows the simple version of events people imagine in advance. Emily placed the pitcher back on the table and looked around the room at all of us. She said that what mattered most now was that everyone understood the situation clearly. Families sometimes struggle when they rely too heavily on assumptions instead of conversations. Jason looked at Maddie and gently reached for her hand across the table. The small gesture seemed to settle the last traces of tension in the room. Maddie nodded quietly and said that when her father heard the announcement on Monday morning, he would probably feel both surprised and relieved. Knowing that the company had a future might mean more to him than any paycheck ever could. I told her that was exactly the outcome I hoped for. Businesses may change ownership, but the people who keep them alive every day deserve to know their work still has value. The candlelight continued to flicker softly in the center of the table as the conversation gradually returned to ordinary topics again, but everyone there understood that the evening had quietly reshaped how we saw one another. The evening slowly settled into a quieter rhythm after that. Plates were nearly empty now, and the candle in the center of the table had burned lower, its soft light reflecting across the polished wood like a reminder that time had passed without anyone really noticing. Jason leaned back in his chair again and looked around the room with a thoughtful expression, the kind people have when they realize they have just watched a story unfold in real time. Maddie rested her elbows lightly near the edge of the table, her earlier tension gone, replaced by something calmer and more reflective. Bree had grown quiet as well, though not in an uncomfortable way. Her curiosity had simply shifted into listening instead of questioning. Emily sat beside me with the same quiet composure she had carried all evening, gently folding her napkin and placing it beside her plate. She had always believed that the most important conversations in a family are rarely the loudest ones. I gathered the 2 envelopes from the table and slipped them back into my jacket pocket. They had served their purpose. Jason finally looked toward me and smiled faintly. He said that if someone had walked into the room halfway through dinner, they probably would have assumed we were discussing business strategy instead of celebrating a holiday. I smiled back and told him that sometimes the two things overlap more than people expect. Families and businesses both depend on trust, patience, and the willingness to understand the full story before making judgments. Maddie nodded slowly at that thought. She said that when she first heard Bree mention the number earlier in the evening, she had assumed the conversation would turn into something awkward or defensive. Instead, it had become a lesson she had not expected to learn that night. I told her that assumptions often begin where information ends. When people only see one piece of a story, they tend to fill the rest with imagination. Bree gave a small laugh and admitted that she had done exactly that. She glanced once more toward the kitchen counter where the phone still rested quietly. The device that had once seemed so important now looked almost irrelevant. Emily noticed that glance, and said softly that sometimes the most valuable part of a conversation is the moment when people stop trying to capture it and start understanding it. Jason reached for Maddie's hand again, and the two of them exchanged a look that carried far more meaning than any words spoken earlier that night. Maddie finally said that when Monday arrived and her father stood in that meeting hearing the news about the company, she hoped he would feel the same calm certainty that had slowly filled the room during dinner. I told her that was exactly what I intended. Businesses can change owners, but the people who give their time and skill to a place deserve stability and respect in return. The candle flame flickered one last time as Emily stood to clear the dishes. The conversation had returned to ordinary topics, but the evening had quietly left its mark on all of us. Sometimes the most important lessons appear in the middle of everyday moments. And that Easter dinner reminded everyone at that table that the full truth behind a story is often far more meaningful than the number that first attracts attention.